Hello everyone, and welcome back to NPA Discovery, the place where music history, human drama, and the untold stories of rock legends come alive. Today, we're diving into the extraordinary, often shocking life of Pete Townshend, the mastermind behind The Who. So buckle up. This isn't just another story about a rock star's wild days, it's about a man who transformed personal pain into art that shook the world. And before we dive in, make sure to like this video, share it with fellow music lovers, and subscribe to the channel. Your support gives us the energy to bring you even more of these deep explorations into the lives of cultural icons. Pete Townshend entered the world on May 19, 1945, in West London. The timing is important, it was the twilight of World War II. Imagine the city then, bombed-out buildings, rubble where playgrounds once stood, a population trying to rebuild after unimaginable destruction. That was the backdrop of Pete's earliest memories. His parents, Cliff and Betty Townshend, were professional musicians. His father played the saxophone, his mother sang with orchestras. On paper, it sounds glamorous, a child born into music, surrounded by artistry. But reality was far less kind. While Cliff and Betty were out touring or partying, little Pete was left largely on his own. And when they were home, things weren't better. They drank heavily, fought openly, and neglected their son's emotional needs. To a child, that chaos doesn't feel like freedom, it feels like abandonment. Psychologists today might call it attachment trauma. At the time, Pete just knew that the people who were supposed to love him most were too distracted to notice him. Now, here's where his story takes an even darker turn. When his parents split up, thanks in part to Betty's affairs, Pete was sent not to live with his mother or father, but with his maternal grandmother. She, too, was unstable, spiraling after a breakup with a wealthy lover. What should have been a safe haven became a nightmare. Later in life, Townshend would suggest that the psychological scars of that period shaped him permanently. Think about that. A boy wandering the ruins of post-Blitz London, sometimes stumbling across human remains in bombed sites, then returning home to an unhinged guardian. These weren't just sad childhood anecdotes, they became the raw material for Townshend's art. Decades later, when he created Tommy, a rock opera about a boy trapped in silence, cut off from the world by trauma, he didn't even realize at first that he was drawing directly from his own buried memories. This is something that fascinates me about Pete Townshend. His art wasn't a performance, it was a confession. He once admitted that it took him years to recognize how much of Tommy was really his story. That's the kind of unconscious genius that makes great art. You don't even know what you're revealing until the world reflects it back to you. But even trauma can ignite creativity. For Pete, the turning point came in 1956, when he was 11 years old. That summer, he saw the film Rock Around the Clock. For millions of kids around the world, that movie was an introduction to the rebellious power of rock and roll. For Pete, it was like lightning striking. That Christmas, his parents gave him his first guitar. And here's something worth pausing on. Children who grow up in unstable homes often find salvation in one of two places, escape or expression. For Pete, the guitar wasn't just an instrument, it was both. It gave him a way out of his loneliness and a way to scream without words. But life at home didn't suddenly improve. His parents often mocked his appearance, especially his large nose. Imagine being a teenager already insecure, already wounded, and hearing your own father, after a few drinks, say, "Looks aren't everything." His mother, glamorous and image-conscious, wasn't any kinder. Pete later quipped, "How they spawned me, I'll never know." That ridicule cut deep. It's no surprise that Townshend's stage persona, wild, destructive, unignorable, was in many ways a rebellion against being overlooked. If his parents couldn't see him, the whole world would. The birth of rock destruction. By 1964, The Who were beginning to carve out a reputation in the London club scene. They had energy, they had attitude, but they didn't yet have an identity that set them apart. That changed one night in North London at the Railway Hotel. Pete Townshend, already known for his aggressive stage presence, accidentally slammed his guitar into the low ceiling mid-performance. Most guitarists would have laughed it off, apologized, and carried on. But Pete? He doubled down. Instead of treating it as an accident, he turned it into a spectacle. Right there, in front of a stunned crowd of teenagers, he smashed his guitar into splinters. The audience went berserk. What could have been a clumsy mistake turned into the birth of a legend. From then on, smashing guitars wasn't just a gimmick. For Pete, it was catharsis. He later explained that destruction on stage mirrored the chaos inside him. It wasn't just theater, it was therapy. Think about it, a boy ridiculed at home, ignored as a child, scarred by instability. On stage, he could finally control destruction instead of being its victim. Every shattered guitar was a statement, I decide when things break. The crowd didn't know all that. All they knew was that they were watching something no one else in rock was doing. In a world of polished Beatles harmonies and Rolling Stones swagger, The Who gave fans violence, danger, and raw emotion. My Generation, a youthquake in sound. In 1965, The Who released My Generation. It wasn't just a hit, it was a manifesto. The stuttering vocals, the crashing rhythm, the snarling attitude, it all screamed frustration. It became an anthem for disaffected youth in Britain, kids who felt unseen in a society obsessed with respectability. Pete's lyrics, "Hope I die before I get old," were shocking, even rebellious. But they weren't just shock value. They came from a very real place. Townshend feared irrelevance more than death. To him, growing old meant becoming invisible again, just like he felt as a child. And here's what's brilliant, My Generation wasn't a carefully calculated political statement. It was instinct, raw and unfiltered. That's why it resonated. Listeners heard their own anger, their own rebellion, reflected in Pete's words and Roger Daltrey's snarling delivery. The single rocketed up the charts, cementing The Who as something different, louder, angrier, and more dangerous than their peers. And while the Beatles sang about holding hands, and the Stones leaned into bluesy mischief, The Who became the soundtrack of smashed ceilings, broken strings, and teenage fury. Pete's sharp tongue was as destructive as his guitar. In interviews, he didn't hesitate to trash-talk his contemporaries. In 1965, at the height of Beatlemania, he dismissed their instrumentals as flipping lousy. Later, he even questioned whether Paul McCartney had anything to do with rock at all. This wasn't just arrogance. Pete understood something about branding before most musicians did. Controversy keeps you in the headlines. Every jab, every insult, kept The Who in the public conversation. But it also revealed Pete's deep insecurity. If you don't feel like you belong, sometimes the easiest defense is attack. At the 1967 Monterey Pop Festival, The Who clashed with Jimi Hendrix over who would perform first. The standoff became legendary. Hendrix literally played his guitar in Pete's face during the argument, as if to prove he was untouchable. A coin toss settled it. Pete won, but Hendrix still stole the show later by setting his guitar on fire. Townshend didn't like being outdone. But rivalry also pushed him. He realized The Who couldn't just play well, they had to detonate on stage. Woodstock, fury at dawn. Fast forward to August 17, 1969. Woodstock. 500,000 people, the defining festival of an era. The Who were scheduled as one of the final acts, but chaos delayed everything. They didn't take the stage until nearly 5 a.m. Exhausted, wired, and frustrated, they played with ferocious energy. The crowd was entranced. But then, mid-performance, political activist Abbie Hoffman stormed the stage. He grabbed the mic and ranted about an imprisoned friend. Pete Townshend wasn't having it. This was The Who's stage, their moment. Fueled by exhaustion and rage, Pete didn't argue, he acted. He swung his guitar at Hoffman, knocking him off stage. Then he warned the audience, the next person who walks across the stage is going to get destroyed. The crowd cheered wildly. This wasn't just a rock show, it was theater, violence, and rebellion rolled into one. But for Pete, it wasn't an act. It was real fury, real adrenaline. He wasn't protecting a brand. He was protecting his fragile sense of control. Quadrophenia and internal wars. By 1973, Pete had written another ambitious rock opera, Quadrophenia. It explored the mod subculture, identity crises, and youth alienation. It was musically rich, lyrically profound, but creating it nearly tore the band apart. During a promo shoot, Roger Daltrey lost patience with Pete, who was heavily intoxicated. The argument escalated. Pete swung his 24-pound guitar at Roger, nearly hitting his head. Daltrey retaliated with an uppercut that knocked Pete out cold. An ambulance was called. As Roger later admitted, he thought he might have killed his bandmate. Pete survived, but the incident revealed just how combustible The Who had become. They weren't just smashing guitars, they were smashing each other. And yet, somehow, out of this chaos, music of staggering brilliance emerged. That's the paradox of Pete Townshend. Destruction and creation were always intertwined. The birth of Tommy, art from trauma. By the late 1960s, Pete Townshend wasn't just a guitarist anymore, he was The Who's visionary. While Roger Daltrey brought the voice, John Entwistle the bass thunder, and Keith Moon the manic chaos, it was Pete who dreamed bigger than any of them. In 1969, he unveiled what seemed at first like a wild experiment, Tommy, a full-blown rock opera. At its heart was the story of a boy traumatized by witnessing a violent family secret, retreating into silence, cut off from the world. But inside his mind, music became his salvation, and eventually he rose to a kind of spiritual leadership. To fans, Tommy was groundbreaking, an ambitious double album with a narrative arc, something rock had never truly seen before. But what made it powerful wasn't just the music, it was the raw emotion behind it. Townshend later admitted that much of Tommy reflected his own scars from childhood neglect and abuse. Without even realizing it, he had turned his pain into a mythic story that millions could connect to. The Who performed Tommy Live with a ferocity that cemented their reputation as one of the most electrifying bands in the world. Woodstock in 1969 was their defining moment. The sun was rising as they launched into See Me, Feel Me, and for a few minutes, it felt as if Townshend's vision had captured the spirit of an entire generation. But there's a detail often overlooked: while audiences were in awe, Pete himself was uneasy. He felt torn between being hailed as a rock messiah and his growing obsession with spiritual guru Meher Baba, whose teachings called for humility, self-denial, and transcendence of the ego. This tension, between fame and faith, chaos and clarity, would haunt Pete for decades. The Cincinnati tragedy and The Who's disbandment. December 3, 1979. The Who were scheduled to play in Cincinnati, Ohio. It should have been another triumphant night, but instead it became one of the darkest moments in rock history. Before the show began, thousands of fans rushed toward the arena doors, desperate for a good spot in what was mostly festival seating. The crowd crushed forward, and in the chaos, 11 people were killed, trampled to death before a single note was played. Here's the haunting part: The Who didn't even know what had happened. The concert went on as scheduled, while outside, ambulances carried away the victims. When Pete Townshend and the band finally learned the truth, they were devastated. Pete, in particular, carried the weight of guilt. To him, the idea that his music, meant to liberate and inspire, had indirectly contributed to such loss was unbearable. The Cincinnati tragedy marked the beginning of the end. Tensions within the band were already at boiling point. Keith Moon's death had left a void that no one could fill, and Pete's own addictions and inner conflicts were spiraling out of control. By 1982, The Who announced they would disband after one final tour. For fans, it felt like the closing of a chapter in rock history. For Pete Townshend, it felt like collapse. Without The Who, who was he? Scandal, self-destruction, and controversy. The 1980s and 1990s were turbulent decades for Townshend. On the one hand, he proved that he could stand on his own. His solo albums, particularly Empty Glass in 1980, earned critical acclaim. Songs like Let My Love Open the Door showed a more vulnerable, melodic side of Pete, proof that his creativity hadn't died with The Who. But his personal life told a darker story. He was battling alcoholism, suffering from depression, and enduring a painful collapse of his marriage. The same intensity that fueled his genius also drove him toward destruction. And then came the scandal. In 2003, Townshend's name was splashed across headlines after being arrested for accessing a child pornography website. Pete claimed that his intent was research, for an autobiography and his long-standing campaign against child abuse, something he himself had experienced in childhood. The police investigation eventually cleared him of possession charges, and he was placed on the sex offenders register for 5 years. But the damage was done. His reputation was stained, fans were divided, and critics debated whether his explanation was credible. For a man already struggling with self-doubt, the scandal was a near-fatal blow to his public image. Yet, here's the nuance that often gets overlooked: Pete Townshend never stopped speaking openly about abuse, trauma, and the lifelong scars they leave behind. Whether one believes his explanation or not, it's undeniable that these themes had haunted his work since Tommy. He once admitted, "I was writing about myself long before I realized it." Redemption, late career, and legacy. Despite everything, the addictions, the tragedies, the scandals, Pete Townshend survived. More than that, he found a way to keep creating. In the 2000s and 2010s, The Who reformed for tours, this time with only Roger Daltrey and Pete at the helm. They were older, scarred, and less wild, but the fire was still there. Audiences filled stadiums not just for nostalgia, but because the songs still mattered. Baba O'Reilly, My Generation, Won't Get Fooled Again, they weren't relics. They were living anthems, passed from one generation to the next. Pete also published his memoir, Who I Am, in 2012. For the first time, he laid bare the contradictions of his life: the child who felt invisible, the guitarist who demanded to be seen, the spiritual seeker who got lost in excess, and the survivor who somehow turned pain into power. What's most remarkable is this: Townshend never stopped searching. Unlike many rock stars who grew bitter or complacent, he kept questioning himself, his art, and the world around him. Even in his 70s, he was pushing The Who to release new music, insisting that their story wasn't finished. So why does Pete Townshend matter today? Because his life embodies the paradox of rock and roll itself. It's destructive and redemptive, shallow and profound, ego-driven and yet capable of transcending ego altogether. Pete once smashed guitars on stage to protest the machinery of fame, yet he also wrote some of the most enduring songs of the 20th century. He lived on the edge of ruin, yet found ways to transform ruin into beauty. And maybe that's the ultimate truth of Pete Townshend. He is proof that even from trauma, chaos, and scandal, art can emerge that speaks to the human soul. His story isn't neat, it isn't clean, and it certainly isn't easy, but it's unforgettable. And there you have it, the explosive, tragic, and ultimately redemptive journey of Pete Townshend. A man who turned his wounds into anthems, his failures into lessons, and his chaos into history. So what do you think? Was Townshend a genius haunted by his past, or a rock star consumed by his own contradictions? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear how his story resonates with you. If you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like this video, share it with fellow music lovers, and subscribe for more untold stories of the icons who shaped our world. Until next time, keep the music alive.